So, dear colleagues, welcome back to our place of EU Study Days. I remind that this project, EU Study Days, is an educational project for Ukrainian students and graduates, which is launched by the Delegation of the European Union to Ukraine. And we continue our session today, Dnipropetrovsk, and I'm very happy and glad to introduce to you Mr. Holger Rommen, who is the head of Contracts and Finance section of the Delegation of the European Union to Ukraine. And Holger will speak today about the EU assistance and the major ideology, major principles, and major ideas and projects and directions of the EU assistance to Ukraine. Holger?
Thank you very much. And I'm happy to be here. Good morning again. I'm going to talk to you about or give you a general overview of the EU assistance to Ukraine. I'm going to, first of all, talk about the context from the EU's perspective. Then I'll tell you something about the evolution of the EU assistance to Ukraine since 1991. I'll give you information on the 2011 to 2013 strategy for assistance to Ukraine. Then there will be some areas that are not covered by the strategy, but still are areas of assistance. I will give you an overview of what the current portfolio of assistance is. And then I'm going to ask the question, what next? To all of us. So on the context, first of all, on assistance in general. So traditionally, development aid was a donor-driven exercise. So donor countries around the world tried to help poor countries, and they decided what to do and basically did it themselves. Concrete aid was provided, like for example, if it was decided that a bridge was needed, donors came and built the bridge. If there was shortage of food, food was provided. Parallel structures were set up next to the government to deliver assistance. So basically, it was rather a situation where fish was provided instead of providing fishing tackle or a fishing net. That changed over time, and most importantly, or the recent big change was the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness in 2005, where partner countries, over 100 of them, and donors signed the declaration, including main principles like ownership by the beneficiary country, alignment of aid with the country's policies, harmonization, managing for results, and mutual accountability. As far as the geographical context is concerned, let me first of all ask you a question. What happened in November 1989? Any volunteers? Sorry?
In Germany?
In Europe. The Berlin Wall came down. And in August 1991, and among, great. Who of you were born then? I was, huh? Okay, so you basically, many of you have lived in independent Ukraine and no other countries, I suppose. So, at the time, maybe one more question before I move on. How many member states did the European Union have in before 1995?
6.
No. Before 1995, 12, and then 3 new member states came in 1995 to make it 15. How many came in 2004? 2007? And recently, 2013? So we're now how many?
20.
Yeah. Do you have an understanding, or can you imagine what that means for a big super governmental multi-country structure to move in less than 20 years from 12 to 28? It's a huge challenge in itself, you know, to keep that process on the road successfully, to coordinate policies, and to react appropriately to the world's challenges. At the beginning of the 90s, if we look back at what we just said about assistance, actually there was another important change through the collapse of the Soviet Union, because all of a sudden a different type of assistance was needed. It was on a large scale, a need was perceived to provide assistance to help countries manage the transition from central or planned economies to market economies. It meant huge opportunities for Europe, for other parts of the world as well, but particularly, of course, for Europe, for the countries concerned, but also, in effect, threats and risks. Think, for example, of the stockpiles of weapons, and so on and so on forth. So Europe didn't have a lot of time and reacted very, very quickly and started cooperation. First of all, mainly under the instrument called TASIS, and to a large extent the assistance that was provided at the time was very much still based on old concepts of development. Technical assistants were hired and supplies were purchased where needed, and so on and so on forth. Fast forward to 2004 again. In 2004, many of the countries who formerly were part of the Eastern Bloc, of a group of countries that followed completely different rules and a different logic than what Europe and the Western world was used to, they were now member states of the European Union. It was at that time that the European Union started to think up a new approach to the world, and particularly to the neighborhood around it. The European Neighbourhood Policy was born. So if you take a look at this, of course this is now the current setup. We have Europe and we have its neighborhood. We have a southern neighborhood and we have an eastern neighborhood. And then we have the Balkans and Turkey, full of candidate countries. And we have, of course, as a very big and important neighbor, also Russia. So the main objectives of the neighborhood policy was to promote good governance, economic and social development in countries around the EU's land and sea borders. It foresaw closer political links and elements of economic integration. Now, as I just said, not all countries in the neighborhood are the same. So the neighborhood policy was defined along few different axes, but most importantly, and for what us concerned, there was the, first of all, the European Neighbourhood and Partnership Instrument, and that was further defined then in the Eastern Partnership. So Ukraine is one of the 6 countries of the Eastern Partnership, and what Europe does is defined in policies agreed by member states, and we have instruments to provide aid, instruments that also come with financial envelopes and with rules on how you actually can provide assistance, meaning that you actually need money for that, and all that needs to fit into our budget procedures, and so on and so on forth. So I've already told you about the political context, and I said something about the evolution of assistance about the evolution in the neighborhood. But I also want to talk about some figures, some of which were mentioned yesterday already. So since 1991, the European Union has provided about 3.4 billion. Yesterday, I think 3.1 billion was mentioned still. And a large part of that assistance was provided on the basis of the bilateral envelope. That's the aid that comes out of the European Neighbourhood Policy instrument, or formerly the TASIS instrument. It's actually aid or assistance that is earmarked for a country, in this case for Ukraine. But there were other areas or means of assistance, like, for example, nearly 700 million euros in macro-financial assistance, close to 800 in the area of nuclear safety, some regional, thematic, and cross-border cooperation assistance was also provided. Now, this is of interest to see how complex it all is in the end. Now, there's not just one decision where you say, look, this is what we want to do, and then it all falls into place. You actually, or the EU has different policy areas and different ways of providing funds and procedures to actually agree to do so. Often when we talk about the assistance, we actually only consider this, but we have to take into account that the whole rest exists as well. So again, total, and that's actually figures before 2011, approximately 3.4 billion. And in that, there was 2.4 under TASIS, 522 under the European Neighbourhood Policy instrument, and there's actually only for 2007 to 2010 there was 120 under the nuclear safety instrument. That is why the figure before was higher. In fact, even I found it difficult to actually compile the figures, by the way. And as I said, throughout the process, or throughout that period, operations were also financed under other envelopes than the bilateral. There are important trends, and they are actually in line with what I've said about the Paris Declaration. Traditional assistance is going down in relative terms, so there is less relatively technical assistance, certainly less supply contracts where the European Union buys something and provides it to Ukraine, and less works where the European Union is in charge of building something. And there is an increase of assistance that is better adapted to aid effectiveness and the Paris Agenda. That is, for example, budget support or joint management with international organizations. Why that? Because as soon as we enter into joint management, at least there is a built-in coordination with the international organizations concerned. And twinning. I think yesterday you work in a twinning project, no? So you would be better able to talk about it than I guess. And over time, and this is now the national programs, the annual allocations to Ukraine went up from annually somewhere in the area of 40 million to recently 180. So we're currently still working under the assistance strategy for 2011 and 2013. And the main priority areas, or the priority areas, are first of all good governance and the rule of law. And under there are 4 sub-priorities. Sub-priority 1 is justice, freedom and security. Sub-priority 2 is integrated border management. Sub-priority 3 is public administration reform and public financial management. I'm going to talk to you later about that. Sub-priority 4 is disarmament. And under the second priority, facilitation of the entry into force of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, including the deep and comprehensive free trade area. There are two sub-priorities, one for the association agreement and one for the DCFTA. And the third area is sustainable development. Sub-priority 1, energy, environment and climate change, as well as transport, and sub-priority 2, regional and rural development. And then, similar to what I said before, also today, there are areas or means of cooperation outside the scope of the bilateral assistance strategy. So everything that is not covered by this strategy with these priorities. But there are ways well, bureaucratic means to make sure that everything that we do outside the bilateral strategy is also in line or does not certainly contradict what happens under the bilateral assistance strategy. So there are TAIEX and Sigma. TAIEX is the Technical Assistance and Information Exchange, which is an instrument that helps countries with regard to the approximation, application and enforcement of EU legislation. Sigma is a support vehicle for improvement in governance and management that is financed by the EU, but that is done in cooperation with the OECD. Then there are regional initiatives, so there's also certain programs that are defined for the region from which Ukraine benefits, particularly in the area transport, energy, environment, border and migration management, as well as fight against transnational organized crime, customs, small and medium-sized enterprise cooperation, civil society cooperation, and culture. And then there is cross-border cooperation, which has 4 overarching aims. It's supposed to promote the economic and social development in border areas, the work between countries together to address common challenges. And Ukraine currently benefits from 4 such programs. One together with Poland and Belarus, one with Hungary, Slovakia and Romania, and another one with Romania, Ukraine, Moldova and the Black Sea Basin. Nuclear safety instrument was mentioned, higher education programs, so we mentioned yesterday already 10% Erasmus Mundus is part of assistance as well. And then there are thematic programs where basically we address the whole world, and mainly NGOs, but in some instances also local authorities are invited to present their project ideas, and then we score them and award contracts to the best proposals, like for example to in the area of environment or in the area of local governance, and so on and so on forth. So now it becomes concrete in terms of what the portfolio of ongoing contracts holds in. So in the end, after having gone through a process of strategic planning, setting up a strategy, setting aside concrete commitments in annual procedures at some point, well, you need to conclude contracts in order to actually provide funds to do something. So in one of the, or 2 types, very traditional types of cooperation was actually direct supplies and works contracts, in which the European Union, as other donors, actually went out and supplied goods and did works. We still have some of those. So there are actually still now 6 ongoing works contracts in Ukraine for a total value of about 26 million euro for the country, for the construction of temporary accommodations for migrants. There are also supply contracts still. You see that the amounts now all of a sudden become rather modest, but still we have that in our cooperation. We have supply contracts for the delivery of IT equipment and vehicles to the State Customs Service and State Border Guards. And we still, although as I say it goes down in relative terms, we do have technical assistance contracts still. So there are right now 11 ongoing service contracts to provide technical assistance for a total amount of approximately 33 million euros. And examples of the areas where we have such technical assistance are in civil aviation safety and security, capacity building of the state agency for energy saving and energy efficiency, foreign direct investment promotion in Sevastopol, support to Ukraine's regional development policy. And we have right now 15 ongoing agreements with international organizations for a total value of 94 million. So that actually links back to what I said before, that this type of cooperation actually went up in importance. And as soon as you work with an international organization, such as from the United Nations group, then there is built in an element of coordination, of pooling of efforts. And often, actually, in these cases, we do not only have agreements with just one, but we pool funds with more than one international organization. Examples here is an agreement with the International Labour Organization on effective government of labour migration and its skill dimensions, one with the United Nations Development Programme on community-based assistance, community-based approach to local development, and one with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, assistance in increasing the efficiency of the risk and criminal analysis systems of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine. Now you can imagine that I would not be able to talk to you about the details of most of these programs and contracts, but this is as wide as our portfolio is. And then last but not least, so you can see that actually the amounts of funding that go in here are small, so we talk about small-scale contracts. We have 60 ongoing grant contracts to non-government organizations, local authorities, universities, etc. And examples of supported projects there are building local capacity for domestic solar heating, hot water and insulation for rural and remote areas in the EC region, cultural development. That's the title of a project. Cultural development is the source for prosperity of community. Increase of energy efficiency of a rayon hospital. Does anyone know the rayon? I don't know. I don't know where it is right now. Enhanced economic and legal tools for stepped biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation and mitigation. And then twinning. So we have right now 9 ongoing twinning contracts for a total amount of approximately 12 million. So in a twinning contract, we basically bring together authorities from member states with Ukrainian authorities. And the idea there is that a learning process, an improvement process takes place. What is the twinning that you work in?
First one is mine.
It's good, huh, that I mentioned this here. So one, we have development and coordination of multimodal transport and logistic processes in Ukraine. Who is that with? With which?
With France.
With France. France alone or any consortium member?
We have an expert from Greece, but they're not partners.
Okay. And how does it work?
It works, but
Yes, but.
the first twinning where I worked is all with me, it was better
Mm-hmm.
with the Ministry of Interior.
The interior troops.
Yes, internal troops of Ukraine.
Uh-huh. And how are the dynamics in a twinning project? How?
It depends from twinning to twinning, but usually those who are more military or in the civil aviation, they are more willing to cooperate than the normal ministries that are not so military. So.
Mm-hmm.
So you want really nice people.
Yes. And you have someone to choose, you can choose the internal troops from further twinning.
That's actually an interesting remark. Let me quickly go through the other ones that I mentioned here. So there is one ongoing supporting Ukraine in approximating its phytosanitary legislation and administration with EU standards, strengthening of the Ukrainian state space agency's institutional capacity to implement European space programs in satellite navigation, EGNOS and Galileo, and remote sensing. GMES. That is pretty much rocket science. Now, back to ownership. These can only take place when there is a lot of work done before by the Ukrainian authorities. So we actually have a very broad pipeline of possible twinning projects where Ukraine basically needs to define, or the authorities concerned in Ukraine need to define what their needs are, what they would like to see. Because then we don't go out and call La République de France and tell them, look, would you guys like to come over and do something here? No, we actually put member states in competition, and member state proposals are then compared, and we select the best proposal in order to twin the winning member state authority with the Ukrainian beneficiary authority. So the potential for that is big, and actually it's something that has worked with countries like Poland or Lithuania before, who were at some point on the other side of twinning, and now actually are mostly as consortium members, but they now are partners or consortium members in twinnings provided by the EU. Yeah, I suppose that it's basically impossible to read any of this from where you sit. But this is actually where most of our funds go these days. So in total, and that only started in 2008, we have committed 588 million euros for budget support, many of which are ongoing. One has actually been completed, so there was a total amount of 68 million euros paid in the area of energy. There is a new energy budget support program soon to be signed. There is one ongoing in energy efficiency, one in trade, and another one planned for trade. One in transport is ongoing, one in environment, another one planned for environment, and so it adds up to a total amount of nearly 600 million. That sounds, first of all, probably you're not particularly impressed by the amounts of money, knowing that the public sector budget of Ukraine is somewhere beyond 40 billion euros. So that maybe is not such a huge incentive. But if you think again, then it's actually the way that this happens, because it is actually a policy dialogue that takes place. And into budget support programs, we take in experience again from Europe, from member states, where in many areas I think a lot of progress has been made, and the right policies were set. Think of environment, for example, but also in the area of trade or transport. And so there's built-in, through helping to set the right policies and through actually accompanying through incentives, because this money is not guaranteed. It is actually linked to the achievement of policy objectives, to following an agreed policy program, and we can see that that actually gives some leverage. Again, also here, of course, it only works if Ukraine at some point says this is what we want to do, and of course Ukraine designs, co-designs these programs, and if Ukraine doesn't want it, it's not going to happen. So what next? So as I said, the current strategy runs until 2013. So a new cycle starts next year. And I don't know whether you are aware of the way the European Union plans its finances. We work on 7-year cycles, on 7-year multi-annual financial frameworks. And we've just gone through intense negotiations between member states, because it's then basically said, look, we will have spending ceilings of 140 billion euros annually in the period from 2014 to 2020. And then actually basic decisions are being made as to the policy areas where money goes and all that. And of course you need that before you actually can go on and provide assistance to the world around you. So at some point we're going through this process. There will be a financial envelope for the European Neighbourhood Instrument. By the way, non-insiders may actually not notice that there is a change. No, we saw ENPI before, and now it's the ENI. So there will be new regulation, there will be new principles, and I suppose that there will be a lot of learning in the new instrument that should help us do better than before. Within that financial envelope, there will be indicative allocations, country, multi-country, cross-border cooperation, indicative, where there actually will be an amount set aside for the countries benefiting from or working together with us under the European Neighbourhood Instrument. Then there will be a new set of financial instruments for EU assistance. By the way, what is mentioned here, the envelope, is linked to this, but actually even that instrument isn't agreed yet. No, there is actually, again, intense negotiations ongoing because not all member states see things exactly the same way. So the coordination processes are sometimes difficult. And only as soon as that is the case will we be able to program to actually come up with what is now called a single support framework on a country-by-country basis, and that means also for Ukraine, and we will then actually see something that will be similar to what we've just seen for 2011-2013, priority areas and all that, but we're not there yet. And that's also the reason why I cannot tell you anything about it, because it's not decided. Same for multi-country and cross-border cooperation. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that what we're concretely going to do together with Ukraine in terms of assistance is also linked to the association agreement. The assistance that we will be in the position to provide, the assistance that will be needed, the assistance that we may be willing to provide will be different if there is an association agreement than it would be when there isn't one. So yesterday there was an interesting question on what really changes with the association agreement, because many of these areas, I think it was your question, wasn't it? Many of these areas that were discussed and where conditionalities and objectives have been set have been under discussion for a long time. And indeed, there is an association agenda, and we're working on an association agenda where many of the things that are now set out or are set out in the association agreement, hopefully will be signed, are also fixed in the association agenda. So target date, 28th, 29th of November in Vilnius, Third Eastern Partnership Summit, and the question is whether the sides are ready to sign. Any bets? Questions?
So, thank you very much, Mr. Rommen. Any questions? Who is ready to sign the association agreement?
I brought one here.
Okay, guys. Questions?
Well, thanks for your report. And in your report, you mentioned the Eastern Partnership issue as one of the instruments of European Neighbourhood Policy. And as you know, a lot of politicians, they say that the budget of this instrument is very modest, from this speaking, and due to WikiLeaks discoveries, it was stated that it looks like this instrument looks more like the sub to Russia and to Russia's neighbors. So what is your opinion on Eastern Partnership effectiveness in this light?
Effectiveness is not the same as the amounts that are provided. I just would like to come back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that providing fish is not as good as providing fishing tackle and the techniques to actually fish, or maybe actually even to spoon fish, to increase the fish population, or things like that. In terms of doing the right thing, I think what Europe does is good and very helpful. But it will always depend on the government's capacity, on Ukraine's capacity to take it on board and take it forward. Again, this country has a public sector budget that is above 40 billion euros. There's a lot of good things that can be done with that money. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of bad things that can be done with it. I believe that in many of the areas that we work in, we actually help identify the right areas, and we help to set a process in motion to actually address the issues in these areas right. I believe that. Difficult to prove.
Thank you very much. Katerina?
Thank you, Martin, for your effort. My question was, what is the attitude of regular people in EU, for example, German people, on the question why we have to pay for that countries to provide them, to supply them? Because they pay for all of this.
Yes, of course. Taxpayers are looking at the way public funds are spent. That is actually very transparent in European Union countries. I can go on the website of the German government and take a look what they do with their money. I don't pay taxes there, so it's not so. And of course, it is difficult in times of crisis to explain to taxpayers that this is actually something that is needed. And I believe it will come under more pressure. So politicians will have to make a point and defend it and explain why this is necessary. And actually, they have to have the courage to explain why this is in the European interest. And by the way, this is not something that only happens between the EU and the outside world. You may have heard that the euro crisis has led to intense discussions on financial solidarity within the European Union, and particularly within the Eurozone.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I want to know what about project of building a new shelter in Chernobyl, and does the European Union have a hand there, and what other projects, in particular in Ukraine, were accomplished with the help of the European Union?
Yes, we provide funds to the shelter construction. I wouldn't be able to give you the exact amount, but I think it was somewhere in the area of 200 million euros. And I think the funds do not come just from one source. I think the European Investment Bank, another European institution, will probably be in there. But I would have to look it up. So, but clearly the European Union is in there. And again, I think it's definitely in Europe's interest.
EBRD
probably EBRD, yes. It's.
Any more questions?
How EU forms this funding for another countries? Is this some percent from income of country, or this fixed some amount, or what? How does it go?
So we have seen that there is a multi-annual financial framework, and their ceilings are set. The member state contributions are linked to the member state's economic capacity. So it's a percentage of, in the end, it boils down to a percentage of the GDP. But actually, there is also already sources of own income to the European Union through customs, for example, and things like that. So the funds are agreed, the funds are provided by member states. On the other hand, member states are actually beneficiaries of most of our programs. No, we have regional programs within the European Union where funds flow back to regions in the European Union, into areas that are worthy of union support. So that is all negotiated, and member states have a say. Again, as I said, 28, coming to consensus between 28 independent states is never easy, but Europe has managed again for the coming 7-year period.
Thank you, Maxim, and then Sergey.
Okay, every year Ukraine achieves lots of monies of different institutions, different unions, and from my point of view is that actions that shown by Ukrainian government mostly is just a show, just a declaration. I haven't seen any results of this big money, okay. What is your point of view? Do you see that Ukraine government is really using this money on that aims that they declare?
Have you seen any fish caught by the Ukrainian government?
Yes, yes.
I see it on a regular basis on the market. We have to admit that through the change in what we do, we are actually investing, putting our funds ever more into hot air. So it is actually, in the end, we actually invest in brains and attitudes. I think that's a good investment. However, again, it is very, very difficult to prove what the immediate effect and impact of that is. And yes, indeed, we depend on the willingness of Ukraine, and particularly of the Ukrainian government. I leave it up to your judgment. But we want to be in a constructive dialogue. We want to be engaged. We want, well, most of us clearly know already that they want to sign an association agreement. So our answer to the question is, yes, it's worthwhile. We want to continue doing it.
Thank you. Sergey?
I would like to ask, does some internal conditions in the countries of Eastern Partnership have some influence on the amount of European investments? For example, situation with democracy, rule of law. For example, I think Georgia is much more democratic country than Ukraine, but the amount of European investments are less in Ukraine.
It's also a much smaller country. There is now the more for more principle that was decided 2 or 3 years ago, that actually there is funds have been set aside that can be added on to the indicative financial envelopes decided on a country-by-country basis. And that will have an immediate effect on the countries concerned. So if they move on and actually do more than was expected under the objectives that were set, if they are ahead of time, then actually more funds can be provided. That is in place, and actually for instruments such as budget support, minimum standards with regard to democratic principles, rule of law, and human rights definitely need to be fulfilled. No? So yes, that exists.
Thank you.
Using financial assistance or giving financial assistance for Ukraine, what kind of control mechanism could be used to revise and appropriate aid or even such financial assistance? What kind of institutions could be involved in this process, and what kind of results in a sequence of such process?
It was mentioned here, it's actually difficult to actually not throw too much detail at you and admit that I probably haven't done an extremely good job. Where did I talk about, it's actually here. So so first of all, the first level, of course, already of the type of assistance that we're going to be able to provide, the framework is set in the new European neighborhood instrument. And you go down to the next level, there will be what we call a single support framework, in which there will be a lot of textual explanations why things are as they are, and then there will be a list of priority areas in which we intend to provide assistance. And that is a process that actually goes through the decision-making structure in the European institutions. The Commission, the European Commission, being in charge of actually proposing such a framework, and then member states through committees and the European Parliament as the decision makers that will actually nod it off or not and say, this is it, good job, go ahead.
you. Asa?
I just wanted to comment on the effectiveness of the money that Ukraine gets. When you say that the European Union is giving, I don't know, million of euro to Ukraine, it doesn't mean that someone in Ukraine gets this money and says, I will buy myself a Chanel dress. This money is still in the hands of a French or a German European citizen who decides up to the last penny how to spend it and to spend it right. So Ukrainians have no power to decide how they will spend this money given on a twinning or another project. It depends on the programs of assistance, of course. There is a direct, yes, they have, but they're very limited, and there is a lot of agencies that control this money. They don't get this direct money to spend how they want.
Budget support we do.
I get to that. Supplies and works, the European Union is going to pay to contractors, to works contractors or to suppliers. But what is supplied and what is constructed has been decided by the Ukrainian government. We have approved that. But actually, there is, at the beginning, a decision that is taken by the Ukrainian government, where they say, look, these supplies is really what we need for these works.
Ukrainians they always are afraid that our government takes this money to buy themselves a nice dress or a mansion or
We're going to talk about corruption again briefly. I'll get back to Transparency International, all these things. But we are pretty safe here because the European Union concludes contracts, the European Union pays. And actually, technically, that means at some point I will actually press a button and the money goes. Technical assistance. The European Union concludes a contract with a consortium of consultancy companies and pays consultancy companies. However, what the consultancy companies do, what is set in the contract, is actually co-defined, mainly defined by the Ukrainian government. Even what we do with international organizations. We pay money to international organizations and they then pay suppliers, works contractors, consultancies, or whatsoever. But again, the Ukrainian government has an important say in what is actually said in these agreements. Grants. There is an area here where we have vehicles where we actually go out with calls for proposals that we define for ourselves. As I said, many of these are actually globally competitive. Where actually an NGO in, say, Georgia competes with its project proposal for Georgia with an NGO doing something similar or intending to do something similar in Ukraine. But those funds, in the end, that is our conviction, will benefit Ukraine and Ukrainians. Twinning, we pay the member state government that is the leader in the consortium, and they then actually pay the people who work in it basically for the travel they do and things like that. So the money doesn't actually even get to Ukraine, also in twinning. Budget support is the difference. Budget support is the area where the European Union pays funds directly to the Ukrainian government. But only if and when minimum standards are fulfilled, if the public finance management is either sound or there is a credible reform program in place. We'll get back to that later. And if the policy objectives for the area in question have been achieved. So again, there's a big if, and a lot of effort needs to be made. Now that goes into the big pot. So over a period of, say, 5 years, we come to a total of 600 million euro. Again, we compare that to the public sector budget of Ukraine. So we add that to something where we have concerns, and we actually agree there are concerns. And many Ukrainians agree. But that is hope. The fact that many Ukrainians agree, in my opinion, means that at some point it's going to improve.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, we have to finish our online broadcasting and we have to say goodbye to our online spectators, but then we'll continue offline. Okay? Ми кажемо до побачення, на жаль, ми маємо закінчити нашу онлайн-трансляцію, ми кажемо до побачення нашим онлайн-глядачам, але продовжуємо. Okay? So, any more questions?